All right. I've already hinted at some different approaches to language, right? There are two main ways of looking at language. There is the prescriptive way, which is someone tells you how you ought to do something. This is correct. This is incorrect, right? And then there's the descriptive way of looking at it. This is studies in how language is actually used. And the stereotypical division here is between, say, English teachers or, editors or whatever in the camp of the prescriptivists and linguists as the descriptivists, right? And in many cases, you will hear these two camps sort of throwing verbal bricks at each other, complaining about what the other is doing. The prescriptivists are like, oh, if it's just descriptive, then anything goes, right? And the descriptivists are like, you prescriptivists are uninformed bigots. The way I look at things is that in an ideal world, these two ways of looking at language ought to be complementary. In other words, there are times when we need someone to tell us how to say something. Particularly if you are studying a foreign language, right? You just want a teacher to say, this is the way you should say this, right? How, though, do we get to that account of what should be, right? Someone has to sit down and describe how things work. So in an ideal world, we would have the sort of back and forth between the two camps, right? That descriptive people like, dictionaries. Well, let me come back to dictionaries. People would sit down, describe the language, right? And then the prescriptivists would take that description and use it to teach from, right? In practice, things have not been that smooth. While historically that might have been the attempt, there's been a big breakdown in this in English. And a lot of the grammar books that are in use in schoolrooms, like K through 12 classrooms, are following descriptions of grammar, English grammar, that were largely fixed by the middle of the 19th century. And there's a lot that's there that linguistic studies have moved on from, right? It's, and yet you still find these outdated accounts because the schoolbook grammars don't listen to what the linguists are saying. The schoolbook grammars just copy the previous generation of schoolbook grammars, right? And so you get this divergence, right? Where the prescriptive account is, although in theory that should be fine for certain circumstances, is hampered by the fact that it's working from very outdated material, right? I am, by the way, reading all your chat. The one thing that I would generally comment on in terms of difficulties of language is when we talk about a language being hard to learn, we're talking about it being hard to learn for an adult speaker, right? If you were born into a language community, you are going to learn that language no matter what it is. At least assuming you're developmentally normal, right? You're going to learn that language just by being exposed to it, right? So, for an English speaker, learning Korean or Mandarin is hard, right? All right, SG, thanks for the lurk. And, but if you are born into a Mandarin speaking house, you will learn Mandarin automatically, right? It's not hard in that sense. It's just different from what you're accustomed to, right? So Mandarin, for example, is hard for English speakers to learn because, and I'm talking about spoken Mandarin, leave the writing system out of it, because it's got a tone system, which English does not have, right? Every language has those peculiarities. So English might seem difficult to learn for, somebody who's born into a different language group, but that's just because it's a different set of habits to learn. It, you know, it has its complexities, but every language has its complexities. Yeah, some people are better at languages than others. That is definitely true. French won 3 times. Oh, sorry about that, Emmy. All right. I thought I created this little graph to talk about the different ways we can look about language. And I thought I'd use this not only to show like the different areas of language, but also to talk a little bit more about the different ways that traditional approaches, the prescriptive approaches, work through language versus the more descriptive approach that we're going to be taking. And you can look at language either in terms of its structure or how it's used, right? In terms of how it's used, right, you can look at acquisition of language, right? How do children learn the language? How do people learn a second language? Or you can look at the way that language varies, right, in its use. And this is something, of course, that all languages except dead languages do, is that they have variation in them. They change. Over time, when we're talking about variation over time, this is called diachronic change. So historical linguistics is the study of how languages change over time, right? That's one thing that I like a lot because I spent a lot of time studying Old English and Middle English and, those kinds of things. But there's tons of variation. It's not merely, like one monolithic language changing over time. Exactly, just straight up borrowed from Greek. Now, synchronic variation, what we're talking about here is how language is varying at a single place in time, right? Or single time. Not historical change, but what are the variations that we see right now, right? Or at a snapshot in time. So you can have regional variations, right? We were starting to talk about different regional variations. I mean, we've got obviously Corey's here, right? He's got his Irish English. Georgia's here, right? Australian English. So, you have all of that regional change. You also have social change, right? Different social classes vary in how they speak. That you have, different ethnic groups, right? We have African American vernacular English, for example, right? Or, Latino English or Korean American English, so you have all these different groups, social groups that have their own specific markers that aren't necessarily tied down to a particular region, right? You also have individual variation. And this is one thing that I do want to drive home is even you as a single person do not have a single English. You have varieties of English that you adopt. Some of you, this might be more dramatic than others, right? If you have a home language that is very different from the normal standard language, you might find yourself shifting quite markedly between how you speak to your family and how you speak to outsiders, right? Or even if you don't have that, I guarantee you don't speak the same way to your boss, or if you're in school to your teachers, than you do to your friends, right? It's a very different form. So these are all, and you might have your own unique little peculiarities of language, right? A lot of code switching. Yeah. Everybody does it, even if they're not doing it. Yeah. So yeah, trunk versus boot is a regional difference, right? That's British versus American English, classic regional, regional thing. Okay. A whole entire new vernacular. Yep. Torch, flashlight. Exactly, Emmy. Right? Actually, I was in... whose stream was I in just yesterday, I think, where we were talking about the difference between a windshield and a windscreen, right? Which is another pop Pop versus soda is a great regional marker in the US, definitely. The vocabulary differences are some of the big noticeable buggy versus cart. Yep. Sneakers versus trainers. Overpass versus flyover. Let's see. Rubber versus eraser. Proctor versus invigilator. There's all kinds of, like, there are a significant number of remote controls versus sprucers. That's interesting. Lorry versus truck, yes. Highway, freeway is not really a regional thing. That's interesting. The on the motorway, yep. So there's all kinds of, there's a very large number. We could, spend an entire stream just cataloging all of those differences. The vocabulary differences between American and British English are, in fact, if you set aside pronunciation, are in fact the largest differences between the two languages. The syntax is much closer together. So in terms of language structure, right? Sorry, before I forget, this sort of outline I'm giving you is certainly not a complete one of everything that we could do. It was more or less just the big ones that I could fit on one diagram. If we look at it not by how it's used, but in terms of how it's structured, we get into the more classic ways that language is studied, right? And you can traditionally, everything is connected. Exactly. Any of the grammar point, you can't speak. I mean, the grammar is how you speak. You speak English by assembling words, the lexicon here, right? With rules into producing an output, right? Now that is obviously an oversimplification, but this is a classic traditional way of looking at language, right? That it basically consists of two major units, words and rules. And in fact, there's a book by Steven Pinker that's called exactly that, Words and Rules. There are some linguists who have theories that slightly complicate, well, more than slightly, they complicate this picture. It's a little bit too schematic. You shouldn't really think of them as completely separate things, but it's useful, to think about. You've got this, like, when you learn language, what you need a storehouse of units, assembly building blocks that you can string together to create your message, right? And what do the rules consist of? Now, traditional schoolbook grammar doesn't necessarily focus its attention equally on all of these rules, but when we think about the rules of grammar as this mental process, right, there are four really main components. When we're talking about phonology, we're talking about the rules that construct sounds together, right? Not the raw sound itself, but just how they pattern together. When we're talking about morphology, we're basically talking about word parts, the components of words that bear meaning and how we assemble them into words. When we talk about syntax, we're talking about how we assemble words into larger units of meaning. And then when we talk about semantics, we're talking about meaning. Now, all of these have many subdivisions. Semantics in particular, you can view on a lot of different levels, right? You can view semantics on the level of word meaning. You can look at it in terms of how phrases create meanings. You can look at it in terms of complete utterances. The bigger the picture you take, the closer you get to what would traditionally be called rhetoric, right? The ability to express yourself in an elegant way, right? But in addition to the message, it's also important to focus on the medium, right? How are we going to, convey this message, right? Sound, in terms of evolutionary history, human history, is, of course, the primary method of communication, right? Writing is what we focus a lot of our attention in schooling because it is the most central to that educated process. But, the sound is better. Semantics can be cultural. Yes. So semantics will have, semantics are anything involving the meaning. So meanings can have culturally specific significance. And to the extent that that's expressed in language as opposed to symbols, right, then, you can talk about it that way, right? Symbology, like non-linguistic symbols that are meaning-bearing is a related field, but that's getting kind of far astray from the core concerns of linguistics. Robert Langdon, yeah. So yeah, and we should not forget, I've got up there, sign is another medium, which we often forget, sign language, right? For those of you who've had no exposure to sign language, you might not be aware that sign language is not simply gestural English or whatever language is spoken around them. It's an entirely different system of communication. It is something that can be acquired natively by children, without ever having any exposure to other language. It has its own, set of systems that develop from it. So, there you go. You took sign language. That's very cool, Emmy. Very nice. So, I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments about any of these. I'll give you a minute before I move on. You got an A in sign language. Look, if you're motivated, you can succeed in, any of these things, right? If you have a reason to learn something, you'll learn it. Thank you, Davey.